Right, we're going to start now. It's 17:27. We've got a number of individuals here today. There are some people, because of the weather, that have actually said that they are not attending this evening but would like the recording. And so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to talk very briefly, so just 2 slides on the Oxbridge network. This is number 3 in the series of Oxbridge Network lectures, and I will be handing over to Mr. Salt in a moment, and he will then be delivering his lecture. You should, and somebody, if you can tell me, you should be able to see the Oxbridge Network slide. Can anybody tell me whether they are able to see that? Anybody? Can you see it? Anybody? I can't really see. I can't hear from anybody. Yes, I can see it. Good. Okay, thank you very much. Right. Okay. Now, the Oxbridge network is a network of a wide range of schools actually in this area, and we share expertise, and we also have a range of different activities for individuals preparing for university and also thinking long term if you're in the lower 5th or the upper 5th, or even in the 4th form. So forthcoming lectures before we start with lecture number 3 are the following. So on the 15th of March, which is next Wednesday, we have another Oxbridge Network lecture, and that's by Mr. Geddes Curitan, who is going to talk mathematically from uncertainty to proof. So that should be a very interesting lecture, and so please sign up and turn up for that. I've sent the links through to your Oxbridge coordinators, and I've also sent them through to students in my school. The second one, which is next term, is actually Dr. Stuart Hart, and he's going to be talking about Virginia Woolf. And we have a third one, which is the second half of term, and that is Chris Priestley, who's going to do the physics of an internal combustion engine. Other Oxbridge events and activities this term, many of you will be going on them or not going on them. I'm just going to let a few people in to the lecture because they all seem to be in the lobby. And what you have here is other Oxbridge Network events. So we have an Oxbridge Network Essay Prize. It is open to year 12, so we want to give people an opportunity before they go to university of entering an essay prize and hopefully winning one as well. There are 9 prizes to win, okay? And Cambridge will be coming to present the prizes. So please do beaver away and get your network essay prize into your Oxbridge coordinator, and hopefully that it will get selected to come into our judging panel. Second thing is the Oxbridge tutorial event, which is on the 30th of March. This is year 12 only as well. And this is an opportunity to experience Oxbridge tutorials stroke supervisions, small group teaching with a standard of Oxbridge discussion, and that will start at 5 o'clock and go on till about 6:15 at the George Hill in Solihull School, and your Oxbridge coordinators should know all about that. If you've got any queries that they can't answer, then please contact me direct, and that's my email address. The other thing is this will be recorded, and I will be putting it on our new YouTube channel. There is a YouTube channel for the Oxbridge Network now, and so I'll be sending the link out once again and the link for the YouTube channel to your Oxbridge coordinators. Okay, now I'm going to get out of this and I'm going to hand over to Mr. Salt, and I'm going to give him my permissions. So I'm going to make him a presenter. And Mr. Salt, over to you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay, can I pass over to you?
Yes. Hello, can everyone hear me?
Can we all hear you? I can hear you, but
Okay,
great.
Perfect. Okay. Let me get my PowerPoint on because I do have a bit of some stuff to go along with it. So give me 1 second here to get this up. Then we'll be ready and raring to go. So bear with me, but this is about Lionel of Antwerp, who is somebody who I hope no one here has ever heard of. Have you heard of him? No, of course, because you haven't got the privileges anymore. But yeah, this is a kind of unknown figure, and that's why this is called Discovering Lionel of Antwerp, right? Because we don't know exactly who he is, and hopefully here it's coming. Preparing the slides.
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. Okay, yeah. So are we recording or not yet?
Yes, we are recording.
We are recording. Okay. So we'll start off now then. So this is about Lionel of Antwerp, who is the forgotten Prince of England, who I've said was bred to rule Ireland. And that will all become apparent as we go on throughout this talk. And what I hope that you get out of this is an introduction to a topic that is completely new to you, because when you're at university, you will hear and see completely new things, and particularly with history, because it's so wide and vast. You can come across topics like this and then go on to write your thesis on it if you are particularly interested in doing so. So I'll just briefly say that I came across this through a lecture on medieval Ireland. Now, I went to Oxford myself, and as part of the medieval course, one of the talks was on medieval Ireland, and it was something that I was really interested in because I myself have got Irish heritage, right? So there was an interest from there, but also I love kind of obscure things that nobody else has heard about or talked about, right? And that's kind of the interesting thing for me in history, is getting to know these obscure details. And to begin with, Lionel is kind of so obscure that if any of you want to have a look on his Wikipedia page, considering he's the son of Edward III, who's a relatively famous English monarch, it's quite surprising, and especially when you compare it to his other brothers, who are way more famous than him in terms of history, it becomes even more surprising. So our only image that we have of Lionel is this, which is a draw from the time that he was alive, and it's what we call a weeper statue. Now, when Edward III died, he was one of England's longest reigning monarchs. When he died, around his tomb, he had 10 little figures called weepers that surrounded his coffin, and these were all people who were his children. So he actually had 14 children in total throughout his life, but he had 10 statues of his children made, and we can see here that those are his other children. So the most famous is the Black Prince, who is this kind of chivalric hero of the 100 Years' War. And even John of Gaunt, who anyone who's done the Peasants' Revolt will know that when the Peasants' Revolt happens, the peasants burn down his mansion in London. So again, you've got these much more famous siblings that are memorialized alongside Lionel, but our focus today is on what he was doing in Ireland. So a brief description of who he was, because you're probably thinking, well, if he's an English prince, why is he called of Antwerp, right? And this is a name that is basically given to people from where they were born in the location. So Lionel's brother, Edward, who's known as the Black Prince, he's also called Edward Woodstock because he was born in that palace. And so Lionel, he was born in Antwerp while his dad was negotiating with some Antwerpian. It was in the Duchy of Brabant, which is in modern day Amsterdam. So he's negotiating with these people to fight a war against France, and his son is born at the same time, hence why he takes on the name of Antwerp. And interestingly, his mother is called Philippa of Hainault, because she herself was from what we call the Low Countries, this area that is now the Netherlands, and she's from another area there called Hainault. And now, as a child, Lionel was betrothed to Elizabeth de Burgh, who is the 4th Countess, who's the heiress to the 4th Earl of Ulster. And they get married very early at the age of 14. And Edward III is, in my opinion, one of the smartest English rulers. And this is another piece of the puzzle in how smart he was, because he decided to marry off his second son to this heiress, so his son could take the lands of Ulster, right? These lands in Ireland, so his son would be able to have his own bit of territory and his own bit of land. And we can see that he very early on begins to take this title of being the Earl of Ulster, basically when he's a child, right? He's at this time, if he's 14 in 1352, in 1347, he's 9 years old and he's being called the Earl of Ulster here. So right from a very young age, his destiny of going over to Ireland is being settled. But Edward has much more bigger priorities in the first half of his reign than Ireland, right? There's a famous slogan that Ireland always plays third fiddle in English medieval politics. Behind most important is France, and the second most important is Scotland in terms of foreign policy. So Ireland is always kind of on the back burner. And to give context to Edward III's rule, what happens is that he starts the 100 Years' War in 1337, which by 1360, which is when Lionel is finally sent off to Ireland to go and rule, we had ended by that point what we call the Edwardian phase of the 100 Years' War, because obviously it's a 114-year-long war. We can't, we have to split it up somehow. And so this first phase is called the Edwardian phase. And it's probably the most successful period of the war for the English, because, as we can see on this map here, we see that the territories have expanded massively. We go from Edward controlling essentially a small slither of land in Gascony, which was important for trade, to 1360, at the end of this Edwardian phase of the war, with the signing of the Treaty of Bretigny, whereby Edward has completely reshaped the landscape of France. We can see he's got Calais, he's got a huge territory in Aquitaine and Gascony, and he's also, through his support of a rebellious count in Brittany, he's got a bit of that Breton territory, which is kind of in the most southern part of France on that map. And so, as I said, this is the most important and successful phase of the 100 Years' War. So we've got these two kind of really famous battles, which is the Battle of Crécy, which opened the door for Edward to being able to take Calais. And people kind of underestimate the significance of taking Calais. This was a year-long effort. In this battle, Edward had defeated completely the French army, and he didn't decide to march on Paris and take the throne for himself, which is what his overall goal was in the 100 Years' War, was to take the French crown. Instead, he decided to send all his forces to Calais, because he realized that having a port that was the closest in distance to England would be much better in the long run of sustaining longer campaigns and fighting, right? So this is the age of chivalry, the age of victory for England. And this is what Lionel is kind of walking into when he gets appointed to becoming lieutenant or vice regent of Ireland to take over. So he's inheriting this really strong English position in 1361. And we're going to see what he can do with it, right? And yeah, just to make clear here, that Edward's plan, again, I really think that he's a really smart ruler, and this is another reason to add to it. He wants to create what we would call appanages, which are essentially areas of land for his children to own. This is what historically medieval rulers have done. The children would inherit different parts of the empire, we could say, because by this point the territories of England were huge, right? So Edward of Woodstock became Prince of Aquitaine, so his firstborn son takes over those French lands. John of Gaunt, his third-born son, he, through his marriage to Blanche of Lancaster, he secures these really valuable Lancastrian lands in England, and John of Gaunt kind of gets the role of administering the English territories, of running everything that's happening there in England. And so Lionel gets given the task of going and taming Ireland. And here is the situation in Ireland at the time. In contrast to the victories in France, and also, we won't mention it, but Scotland's looking pretty good for Edward III at this time as well. So on all fronts, he's doing quite well. But the problem really is Ireland. And much later, you know, if any of you have done Tudors, you will know that Ireland is the thorn in the side of Queen Elizabeth, and very much so, it's a bit of a thorn in the side for Edward as well. You can see here that the territories in 1300 have decreased massively. And this map isn't the most accurate of 1361 because there aren't really many maps of this era because it's kind of such an obscure topic, right? But this map kind of shows you that really that the land has decreased. The land in the Midlands has gone. The land in the south, which is kind of Leinster, you would call it, is also gone as well. And so the three major problems that Edward's facing, and hence why he sends his son to be his representative, is a decline in royal authority, the resurgence of Gaelic forces, and of course the famous Black Death and Plague. So the first of these challenges then is royal authority and absenteeism. And what we mean by absenteeism is essentially not turning up to do your job, right? A lot of English lords took titles in Ireland. You know, we had the Earl of Ulster, the Earl of Kildare, the Earl of Ormond, all these kind of titles. And Edward, of course, secured the earldom of Ulster for his son Lionel. But the problem is that none of these English lords actually go over to Ireland to defend the territory. And another thing is that there's been no royal presence in Ireland. The last English king or even member of the royal family to even step foot on Ireland by this point in 1361 was King John, which was over 150 years ago. So royal authority has really decayed in Ireland, and territory has been lost. And there's all these lords, English lords, who should be tending to their land. You know, the king has given them their title, and we know that in the feudal system, the deal is that the king gives you this territory, he gives you land, so you can farm and you can make money from it, and in return, you protect the lands for the king. But at this point, that is not happening. And the best example of this is Lionel himself, right? He gets the title of becoming Earl of Ulster in 1333. That's when William de Burgh, who was the previous earl, dies. And so you have this gap before Lionel arrives of when he's coming of age, when he's becoming a young man, when these lands have no protector. And so what happens is that the resurgent Gaelic forces kind of take over the territory, right? And they don't have any real opposition. And we've got a statistic here that at the time in 1360, it was roughly about 5/6 of all that English land in Ireland that was still controlled by England had no present earl to govern over it, because they were all either in England or fighting in France, right? And, you know, one thing to remember at this point is that a big problem with Ireland is that compared to, say, France or even Scotland, there's not much reward for going over there and fighting. If you go over and fight in France, right, the biggest battle of the 100 Years' War up to this point was the Battle of Poitiers, in which the French king was captured and huge ransoms from French noblemen were taken. So there was the potential to get in loads and loads of money if you were a nobleman and went to go fight in France. But if you're a nobleman, there's no real point for you to go over and fight in Ireland, because it's just kind of farmland that has been decimated by hundreds of years of war. And what makes that even worse is the impact of the Black Death. Because when the Black Death hits in 1348, it also arrives in Ireland later that year. And we know that it has a devastating impact in England. And we don't necessarily have huge amounts of statistics for Ireland, but there's some argument to be made that it actually had a greater impact in terms of the population, partly because there's nobody going into Ireland who are English. There's no English colonists travelling over to Ireland at this time to replace those who are dying of the Black Death, right? So you've got this huge problem of no one's going over there to fight, and those who are remaining to defend the colony, they've just had a third to a half of their population wiped off the map. For example, one of the records we do have is from the city of Cloa, in which almost the entire population was decimated, according to its own register. And this quote here was shown to me when I was at university, and I think that it's a particularly heartening one to put into perspective, not just the kind of human element of the Black Death, of what it was like to survive, but of the overall impact. That this Irish chronicler called John Klein, he wrote one final entry in his chronicle, which a chronicle is like, like a record of events, right? So the last event that he recorded ends in him saying, "I leave parchment for continuing the work in case anyone should still be alive in the future, or any son of Adam can escape this pestilence and continue the work thus begun." So this chronicler, his whole town has been wiped out, everyone's dead. He thinks he's going to die, and we think that he did die after this as well. That it goes to the point that he leaves a couple of blank pages in his journal and says, if anyone finds this, if anyone's alive, please have a go at carrying on this. That's kind of how dire the state of affairs were at this time. And also, to make matters even worse, just to add to how kind of apocalyptic it was to be an Englishman in Ireland at this time, you have the rise of these Gaelic forces. And so you've got in 1315 to 18, the Bruce invasions, where Robert the Bruce's brother from Scotland, who's one of the rulers of Scotland, tries to invade Ireland and kind of kicks the English out of a lot of territory in Ireland. On that map that we just saw, a lot of that lost territory came from this period. And that is, by the way, the Bruce that's from the Braveheart films, right? So just to put that into context. So by 1360, there's very little territory that they control outside of what we call the Pale, which is the area kind of around Dublin, this kind of central area. And it's where that phrase, if you ever hear, you're going beyond the Pale here, comes from, because outside of the limits of the Pale, which is this area of Dublin, which the English still control, it is kind of ruleless, right? It's ruled by Irish tribes and chieftains and self-styled kings, but there's no English law and order. So that's where that phrase, beyond the Pale, comes from, about going beyond the outer limits, right, of safety and, from the English point of view of sophistication and civilization. And in particular, so Lionel had inherited these lands in Ulster from William de Burgh, and he was the Earl of Ulster, and his lands, a lot of them were overrun by this O'Neill clan, who are one of the oldest and continuous groups of, we would say, indigenous Irish groups, right? That they are the original people who are in Ireland, not, let's say, the English settlers, right? And so what this leads on to is a plea for help from the what we would call the Anglo-Irish, who are the Irishmen who have English ancestry, right? They moved to Ireland in maybe 1200 when the initial English invasion of Ireland happened. So they've been settled down for many years in Ireland, but they claim English identity, right? These are the ones who control the English lands, and we call them the Anglo-Irish because they are, by this point, a mix of English and Irish cultures. Yes, they are genetically English, but they've been living in Ireland for generations. You know, it's kind of similar to maybe say white South Africans or any other area where colonization happens, that the colonizers over time become more settled and get their own identity that is linked both with their old identity and their new one. So we have this group of the Anglo-Irish, and they're the ones who are defending it. And they have a parliament in Ireland, and it's surprisingly sophisticated. They try and model themselves on the English parliament. So if you look at the records, they always talk in the same way that an English parliament would. They want to have that authority that they are part of the English realm, right? And so there's a quote here of, they have a great council at Kilkenny where the situation has got so dire that they send a letter to the king, and they send the Earl of Kildare and Ormond along to deliver the message to the king and say, you need to sort this out, right? They say, as those who sorrowfully have endured and endure our life in maintenance of your lands and your rights, we can no longer endure. So it's a plea for help, really. And what they're smart, what the Anglo-Irish are smart here, is that they know that Lionel has now come of age. They know that he's the perfect candidate to send over to Ireland to help defend them. And so they very carefully word it, and they say, what we need is a good, sufficient chieftain, stocked and strengthened with men and treasure, of which they can live out of England, as a noble and gracious prince is bound to do. So they don't say, please, can you bring Lionel over? But they say, what we need is a prince, right? We need a prince, and we need somebody who can bring weapons and money from England to help us. And so Edward, hearing these pleas, there's a great quote that Edward in his reply says, you know, Ireland has always been dear to me. And it's true that Edward III had wanted to go to Ireland earlier on in his reign, but problems happened in Scotland and France. Again, you get to that point that for the English, Ireland plays third fiddle to Scotland and France. But at this point, as we said earlier, there's huge victories for the English. They've beaten the French. Scotland's fine. They've now got a bit of breathing room in which they can send soldiers and put a bit of attention into Ireland, which it needs. And so Lionel, he gets there in, there's a bit of a typo there, he gets there in 1361, and he stays there permanently until 1365, and he leaves to go back to England for a short while, but then he comes back for another year or two. So the whole time that Lionel's in charge of Ireland is 1361 to 1367. So this sort of on and off 6-year period where he's in control. And again, it's significant because this is the first time there has been any royal presence in Ireland for 150 years. And what Edward does is, to show how seriously he's taking this issue, he gives Lionel unprecedented powers, right? And this makes sense because he's the son of the king. He wants him to be his direct representative. And so what he does is he gives him the ability to appoint and sack the treasurer of Ireland, which is a power usually reserved for Westminster. And he's also given this special title. He's not known as a governor, which is what all the other English rulers of Ireland were called. The people put in charge of Ireland, they were called governors. He's called a lieutenant or a vice-regent. Translations vary and different. He's given the title in different accounts, but those are the two titles. And they also put a lot of money into Ireland. So from the English Exchequer, in that 3-year period, they spend £18,000, which is a significant amount of money to put into Ireland at the time. French campaigns against France, fighting wars, would cost significantly more. But considering, you know, the priority, this is a significant investment from Westminster, and it's only possible because of the break in the 100 Years' War, and they've got a bit of money to throw around, and so that's what they want to do. So one of the things they do to start off with is to try and solve this problem of absentee lords, and to kind of bolster the finances a bit as well. What they say is that any English lord who owns property in Ireland that does not go over to fight alongside Lionel will have their income from the properties seized for 2 years. So all the money that they could get is then given to the Irish Exchequer so they could fund Lionel's expedition. And what this did was it kind of had a bit of an effect that it actually meant that a lot of English lords decided to sell their land to the Anglo-Irish settlers. And one example is William de Ferrers, who sold his land to Robert Hollywood. These are names that are going to crop up a bit later. Whereas his brother, Henry de Ferrers, decided to go alongside Lionel to actually fight and defend his land. So some people decided to go, some people decided to stay. But either way, it's helping out the English in their attempt to try and take back control of Ireland. And so what I want to do now is look at some of the key events from his rule and kind of see how well he governs. And the first one here is his initial campaign, which is in Leinster, which is this southern part of Ireland on the map, which is here. That's traditionally where Leinster is, which was overtaken by these two clans, the MacMurrough family and the O'Brien family. And so Lionel's first act is to go and try and fight them. Now, it's kind of interesting that he decides to do this, because if he's Earl of Ulster, you would think that he would want to go and try and take over the territories that belong to him, that were meant to belong to him. But he doesn't do this. And I think that it's because he was trying to satisfy the Anglo-Irish. I think that this is the territory that they wanted to take over, and he kind of wanted to gain their support, and so he decided to go along with taking over this territory. And our source for this campaign is the Dublin Annalist, of which there are two different translations which tell two different stories, but both are interesting in terms of what this did. So the first, one of the translations of one of the texts is that Lionel, when he set off to go and fight this campaign, he actually told the English born in Ireland, these Anglo-Irish, not to join him. And after 100 of his English soldiers died, and he probably only brought along with him around 1,000 men to Ireland alongside of him, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in the French campaigns, you're talking about 10,000 men for large-scale warfare. So for Ireland, where they're considering they're fighting against small chieftains and little fiefdoms, that 1,000 men is actually quite a lot. And so in this version, what happens is 100 men die, Lionel is unable to defeat them, and he has to go back to the Anglo-Irish, ask for their help, and together they join up and manage to defeat the MacMurroughs. However, the problem with this is, if you look at the source material, such as the patent rolls, which are some records of English finances and this kind of thing, they don't suggest that there's this dramatic drop in manpower. So that's probably not accurate to what happened. And the other source of what happened for this is this version, in which this historian Leiden translated it as saying that Clarence, which is another name for Lionel of Antwerp, he becomes the Duke of Clarence. But Lionel ordered that no man born in Ireland should approach his camp, and was surprised to find that 100 of his men were missing, until he discovered that these men were Irish born, and that English soldiers, taking advantage of his orders, had massacred them. So in this version, they're saying that the 100 men who died were actually the Irish, the Anglo-Irish who died, and they were killed by the Englishmen. And what this kind of suggests is that there's actually a lot of conflict between the English from England and the English who live in Ireland, right? These Anglo-Irish and the English who come along with Lionel. Now, Leiden notes in a second edition of his book that this story can hardly be taken seriously as a true account of what happened, but it certainly reflects Anglo-Irish and English antagonism. So what it shows is that on this campaign, right from the get-go, though we don't know what specifically happened on this campaign, we do know that there is tension between the Anglo-Irish and the Irish, and Lionel is going to have difficulty in getting them to communicate with each other and getting them to support each other. But one positive thing that happened, and you know, this often happens in kind of chivalric stories, is that people who are kind of adverse to each other end up becoming friends through shared combat, right? And that's kind of what happens here, because what we know for certain is that after the campaign in which they do secure Leinster, they kill the MacMurrough family in slightly cold blood. You know, we would definitely call it a war crime now. The MacMurrough family get captured and Lionel kills them all, essentially cutting the head off the MacMurrough family so they don't pose a threat anymore. And after this campaign, they have this knighting ceremony in which Robert Preston, Walter Cusack, and Robert Hollywood, who is that guy we talked about earlier, who takes land off the English absentee lords, they all get knighted. And of course, what's significant about this is that it's actually a royal knighting. And again, this is the first time that it's happened in 150 years. So this is Lionel successfully tying the binds together between Ireland and the English crown again, right? So he's kind of restoring the ties to the English monarchy through this. Now, a problem that he later finds out is that these tensions between the English that he brings with him to fight in Ireland and the Anglo-Irish who live there, these tensions always remain. And so Walter Cusack, who is a kind of notable figure in the Anglo-Irish community, he speaks a lot in Parliament, in the Irish Parliament, and he's one of those who is knighted in 1361 in that expedition in Leinster. He ends up getting into conflict with Henry de Ferrers, who is one of Lionel's sort of key men. He's made Marshal of Ireland in 1364, so he's a really important English figure in Ireland. And Walter Cusack had a marriage with a woman called Joan Toote, who was this heiress to these lands, but their marriage was annulled. We don't know why. Again, records are kind of weak on this period, but we can kind of piece things together. But what happens is then Henry de Ferrers, the Englishman, marries this Joan Toote, and he wants to take the lands, but Walter Cusack says that the lands by right should belong to him. And so both men lay claim to this land by their different marriages to this woman. And it gets quite serious. Walter Cusack gets the Archbishop of Armagh, Milo Sweetman, to try and excommunicate Joan, so kick her out of the church if she did not admit that their marriage was still valid. And de Ferrers, who is one of these important figures for Lionel, he tries to get Lionel to support him, but Lionel's stuck in the middle. As we saw earlier on this campaign in Leinster, there's a lot of tension between the Anglo-Irish and the English, and so Lionel kind of wants to ride the line between them. He doesn't want to make either side angry. He wants them to work together. So, of course, this is a bit of a difficulty for him. And this continues right through Lionel's tenure as vice-regent, to the point where one of the final things that he does as vice-regent is he has to go and save Henry de Ferrers, because he ends up getting besieged by some of the Anglo-Irish. So it essentially becomes almost a mini civil war, where these Anglo-Irish lords are fed up with this debate about who owns the land, and they go and fight Henry de Ferrers, and Lionel has to go and save him. And so that kind of symbolizes the difficulty that England had in ruling Ireland, that they could not get the Anglo-Irish, who were the Englishmen who had lived there for a couple hundred years and were their own community, to work alongside the new English who were coming to try and save the colony. All these conflicts were happening. And what this kind of leads on to is Lionel's one piece of significant legislation in terms of what he contributed, And if anyone has ever heard of Lionel in any kind of history circles, it will be because of this law, this Statute of Kilkenny, which is particularly significant in the history of Ireland, as creating a separation between the Anglo-Irish and the indigenous Irish. And so what the law does is it creates a separation legally between Irish people and Anglo-Irish people. So it defines them, putting them into two separate categories. And this is the first time it's done legally. And obviously we can see even now the impact of this, that, you know, what this eventually grows into is all the kind of conflict much later on. And this is sort of the beginning of that. And in this quote here from the statute, it talks about why they are creating a legal separation. It says that many English of the said land of Ireland have forsaken the English language, fashion, mode of riding, laws, and they live and govern themselves according to the manners, fashion, and language of the Irish enemies, whereby the said land and the liege people thereof, the English language, the allegiance due to our Lord the King, and the English laws there are put in subjection and decayed. So what the statute is saying is that the Anglo-Irish state has decayed so much that a lot of the Anglo-Irish have taken on traditional Irish attributes, right? Fashion, sense of laws, sense of riding even, right? And that because of that, they want to create this legal separation that you are not allowed to act like the Irish. And so here are some of the clauses. We have in clause 2, it says there will be no allegiance by marriage between the English and the Irish. So no person who is even of English ancestry, so these people who have lived in Ireland for 150 years, they're called Anglo-Irish, they can no longer legally marry somebody who is of Irish descent, 100% Irish descent, right? Clause 3 enforces the use of the English language, the English way of dressing, and the different types of English riding styles. Clause 4 says that the English law has superiority over the Irish Brehon law, because in some cases before then, say the Earl of Kildare might appeal to people using both Irish law and English law. Now they're saying nope. And clause 35, as a way to try and enforce this change, they have twice yearly inspections of each county to make sure that they are following these rules. And there's a really interesting quote here from the historian Curtis, who's a really kind of old one. This is even before the Anglo-Irish War in the 1920s, right? So kind of prescient as to the tensions that happen in Ireland. He says that this is a deliberate provision for the legal division of Ireland into two nations. But that leads a question of, were the statutes actually followed? Were these kind of strict laws that separated the English and the Irish from each other, were they followed? Well, not really. We have some examples here of how quite soon after, as soon as the 16th of June 1368, which is less than 2 years after these statutes of Kilkenny were passed, that the Earl of Desmond had an Irish tutor for his son, which should have been banned. And then, despite the fact that Gaelic musicians were banned as well, we have a petition in 1375 that a famous Irish harper, an Irishman who could play the harp really well, could go and play music for the Irish Parliament, right? So they're not necessarily following the laws to the letter, but what is significant about them is it marks a shift in tone of this legal division between the English and the Irish, right? Creating kind of a tiered system between them. And so that kind of leads us on to, overall, how did Lionel fare then as ruler? of Ireland. And really, by 1367, kind of very little had changed in terms of territory. They'd secured Leinster. Lionel did go on an expedition later on to take back some of those Ulster lands that were his as Earl of Ulster, and those lands were taken back. So some territory was gained, but literally within a matter of years, they were lost again to these Gaelic forces, to the indigenous Irish. And kind of a sad thing is that if Ireland is playing third fiddle to Scotland and France, by this point, at the end of the decade, Edward's attention had completely gone from Ireland, right? He decides to shift back towards Scotland and France because tensions are rising in Aquitaine. The 100 Years' War is about to start yet again. And also he has a kind of strange scheme to try and put his son John of Gaunt on the throne of Scotland. So no longer is Edward and the Westminster administration interested in paying for Lionel to have minimal success in Ireland. And what Edward ends up doing is that he recalls Lionel from Ireland. And as we said earlier, one of Lionel's last actions is to rescue one of his loyal retainers, one of his loyal friends from the Anglo-Irish, right? So he does not leave on the best of terms anyway. And so I think that Lionel was probably quite grateful to get out of it. It was a bad situation that he could not solve. And so what happens is that Edward sends him off to try and forge links with some of these Italian kingdoms, right? These dukedoms, which are really rich in Italy from trade. And so he marries him off to Violetta Visconti, who's the sister of the Duke of Milan. And during the festivities, they have a famous 3-week-long kind of binge party, which sounds amazing. But what happens is that Lionel ends up dying sort of halfway through these festivities, 3 weeks in. So either he had sort of way too much to drink, or what was a popular theory at the time was that it was a suspected poisoning. Now, why, we don't know, but, you know, the son of the King of England is an important figure. But it kind of leaves a dampener on Lionel's legacy. I mean, when he was in Ireland, he's a young man, remember, he's in his 20s trying to rule this kingdom, and he doesn't do a great job of it, and he ends up getting sent way off to Italy, and he ends up just dying. And that's kind of the reason why we don't know much about Lionel, because he doesn't have a particularly long or illustrious career. And this quote here, just to finish us off, sums up the situation of Ireland during the reign of Edward III and the impact that Lionel actually had. That in 1368, so a year after Lionel had left, this chap here called Thomas Leroux was ordered to go to Ireland to have a look around by Edward III. And the king asks him to report back on the state of the colony that Lionel had left it, because the business is near to the king's heart by reason that the loss and destruction of Ireland are more than ever manifest. That even after all this money has been invested, all this time, Ireland is perhaps in an even worse situation than what it was. And those reasons are because there is conflict between the Englishmen who travelled with Lionel and the Anglo-Irish who had been settled down for over 100 years. They could not stop the resurgent Gaelic forces, and it was kind of, at that point, throwing bad money after good money. And so that's kind of the sad state of affairs of Ireland at the time. So that is me finished with the talk. Shall I give you control? Oh, there we go.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Salt. I'd like you to write any questions that you have in the Q&A box. On the top of your screens, there is a Q&A. We're actually not using the chat at the moment. We're doing the Q&A. So has anybody got any questions? I'm going to start the ball rolling. Okay. And I'm going to ask a quick question because what was really interesting to me was that the seeds of the circumstances that we actually have in Ireland at the moment seem to have, and it's only seem to have been sown by this guy, Lionel. So why is he so obscure? Was it because of the poisoning and he died very quickly? Or was there no recognition over the centuries that this guy had actually had such an influence?
It's kind of two-folded, really. The one is that I think we historians kind of underestimate these statutes of Kilkenny, and that it's kind of we more focus on the later religious tensions, right, with the Tudors, you know, when it becomes Catholics fighting Protestants in the English Civil War, and we don't really look at it in terms of it being almost a racial conflict, which at this point, that's what the conflict's over. It's about over, you know, whether you're native Irish or indigenous Irish rather, or you are of English descent. And the other problem is what that I had. So I did my thesis at university on this, and the problem is that there is a lack of sources. I mean, I've got a reasonable amount of sources in this presentation, but the problem is that they are difficult to translate because they're written in Gaelic, and really the only way you can get them, or texts are translated and published, is through Trinity College Dublin, right? And they are doing a much better job now than say in the 60s or 70s, that period, right? So I think recognition is growing. I know that when I did my thesis, I did it with John Watts at Oxford, who's a prolific medieval academic, and he definitely is part of this growing recognition. He did a book that was called Shaping the Nation, which is the Oxford history of this period, and he has a whole chapter dedicated to Ireland on it to kind of bring more recognition to it. There is growing, but I think the problem is the sources.
Okay, thank you, guys. There will be some questions coming up for Mr. Salt. They should be able to pop up, Mr. Salt, in the Q&A. So please ask any questions. There are some more here that I will see here. Okay, there's something coming up now. Would you like to, when the questions start coming, Mr. Salt, would you like to read them out and sort of respond?
Of course, of course. Yeah, I can talk about some of these then. So why was Ireland important to Edward III? That is actually a really interesting question. I think it affected other areas of Edward, because Edward wanted to put forward the idea during the 100 Years' War that he was the rightful ruler of France, and that he wanted to kind of fight a propaganda war, if you will, that he would run France better than the current French regime, right? The current French rulers. And so perhaps part of that in his own mind was that if there's weak spots in my own government, right, in my own area of control, such as Ireland, then it is not showing that I can govern my own kingdom well enough to be able to govern another kingdom. So that's part of it. Also, he does have this kind of sense of a natural right to rule in himself. You can definitely tell that later on when Richard II, who ends up getting deposed, he's very much he's very much in the style of his grandfather, who is Edward III. They both have kind of similar conceptions of kingship. and that they should rule all of their kingdom, and that it's unjust that these, kind of, as they would see them, revolting Irish indigenous people would control the lands, right? They don't want that. What is it about the English persona about trying to control Irish customs, language, and identity? I think at this time, I think that there was a fear amongst the people, the Anglo-Irish who lived in Ireland, that they were losing their English identity. And so what they wanted to do was preserve that. I mean, there are other historical examples, aren't there? At one point, right, I think it was before World War One, we were a bit of a joke that it was army regulation to have a mustache, right? And so there's often a lot of strange sort of fashion choices, but it's symbolic, isn't it? It's symbolic of who you are and what you represent. That is kind of the problem. What was King Edward's final goal? From what we have heard here, he had campaigns in France, Scotland, and Ireland. How much more did he want, or would he have stopped his expansion having taken France? Great. So getting a bit more into overall Edward III. His final goal, his goal pretty much throughout his entire life, was to take the French crown. Over time, that kind of gets muddled, and particularly after the 1360s, when England starts to lose the 100 Years' War, his attitude changes into he wants to kind of leave his children with enough land to control. He wants to preserve at least some of the lands in France. So it shifts because he rules for over 50 years. So his priorities change massively. I mean, right at the very start of his reign, what's really interesting is that he was planning to go on crusade with the King of France before he declared war to claim the throne. So as a very young man, he wanted glory. As he got older, he wanted his right as a king to take over France. And later on, as everything starts to crumble, he just wants to preserve what he's still got, right? But as a hypothetical, if he had taken France, I don't think there's anything stopping him going further, because he had 9 living children, so he would have found a way to kind of forge marriage alliances all over the place. The question of whether Lionel was killed or not is an interesting one. There aren't really many sources to say that he was killed. It's basically just in like English chronicles. I think there's a couple of English chronicles that say, this year the son of King Edward died. He was murdered by the ruler of Milan or something like that. And there's no evidence for it. And also there's kind of a lack of justification. Why would the Duke of Milan want to kill him? But that's just one theory. Honestly, I think that it was just the fact that he parties too hard and died of an illness, I think. But actually, a lot of Edward's children died young. He had 2 daughters, which both died in 1361. One of his daughters died earlier on of the plague. What was that? Why was he called Lionel? That's interesting, actually. I don't know, because Lionel's not really an English name, is it? It's not a particularly, at this time anyway, you don't hear many Lionels. I mean, perhaps I don't know off the top of my head, but perhaps it's due to his mother, Philippa of Hainault. Perhaps it's a traditional name from the Low Countries, maybe.
There is just one more question, I think, coming up.
Mm.
And then we'll finish unless anybody's got any further questions.
To explore Irish history further, that's a really good question because it is quite difficult to find. There are a couple of books out there, but mainly you will find them you'll find sections in kind of survey books of England. You know, they'll talk about English history. So I was talking about earlier, a good place to start might be, it's called Shaping the Nation, and it's by John Watts, and it covers, I think, like 1100 to 1400, and they've got a whole chapter in on that about medieval Ireland and how it changed during this time, because there's not a lot in the English historiography that is easy to access, but that's a good place to start, and you'll find that there are sources, you know, in the footnotes that will have you to connect with the places. There is also stuff on Trinity College Dublin's like websites and this kind of thing. They did have a project where they got all the Irish parliamentary records translated and they're all online. So that's another thing. But I won't lie, it is difficult to find a lot about medieval Irish history because it's kind of obscure. But if that's the last question, I think that's a good place to end, that I hope that throughout this talk that you kind of found it interesting anyway, even if it perhaps is difficult or confusing to understand because there is a lot of stuff going on here. It's a very complicated time, but I hope that you kind of found something interesting in knowing about this.
Well, I'd like to thank you, and actually it certainly opens my eyes to the seeds of where we are today with Ireland and the relations between Ireland and England as well, actually, which is not just about the religion, as you rightly pointed out. Can we show our appreciation to Mr. Salt, please, by raising our hands or by giving him a clap? That would be very great. I'd be very grateful. Okay. Thank you. Oh, goodness, we've got lots of clapping going on. Thank you so much. And obviously, if anybody's got any further questions, then please let me know and I can pass them on to Mr. Salt. We do have a lecture next week on the 15th, and it's Mr. Curitan on uncertainty to proof. And obviously, that would be an incredibly interesting one. We've had a couple on fractals before from Mr. Curitan, and he's a very entertaining and humorous speaker. So hopefully you'll learn something. You don't have to be a mathematician at all, and so hopefully you will learn something next week if you would like to join us. If you don't join us, then obviously these lectures will actually go on the YouTube channel, and so you can access these lectures afterwards, and also talk to the lecturers if you are the remotest bit interested in taking any of these further. Okay, thanks very much, and it is a snowy night, so safe journey home to anybody who's actually still at school, which I am, and speak to you very soon, and thank you once again for a really illuminating lecture. Okay, bye-bye everybody.
Thanks very much. Have a good evening.